Thank you for having us. This is really exciting. Thanks to Jacob and to Google. It's great to be here. I run our most best companies to work for list, among many other things at Fortune, and you guys are always a stalwart, if not the winner. So it's great to be here and see it all in action. So when people ask me, when I tell people I'm writing this book, or when I was writing the book and I would say, oh, I'm writing a book about the end of the suburbs. I have a section in the book, actually, where I talk a lot about this, because everybody has this some kind of emotional connection to this topic and this argument. The argument's very clear when I tell them what the book is called, The End of the Suburbs. And so I got a lot of high fives, good for you, that's awesome, that's great. I got a lot of, I live in the suburbs, I hate it there. I got a lot of, I live in the suburbs, but I have to be there. Without kind of asking for this reaction, I got a tremendous amount of people's pent-up issues about the suburbs. And I'm not anti-suburb. I wrote this book for a number of reasons, not because I think that the suburbs are bad and evil and I'm a condo-dwelling, espresso-drinking urbanist.
But you are.
But it's not technically a condo. But I was shocked at the response I got while I was reporting this book. And towards the end, I say this in the book, towards the end of the process, I would be out at cocktail parties or wherever in small talk. This project would come up. And in addition to people's opinions about it, people had lots of questions about it, and people wanted to engage about it, and people wanted to talk about it. And as I approached my deadline, I stopped bringing it up on purpose because I knew that if I brought it up, it would mean I would be in conversation for another 45 minutes when I really had to get home and finish the book. So it struck a chord. It struck kind of a lightning rod, but not a negative one. I was telling Jessi in the car over, I've gotten a lot less hate mail than I thought I would doing this book.
So we're going to get to the hate mail question. Let's back up. I mean, I don't want to presume that we understand the thesis from the title of your book.
Sure.
What are you trying to say about the suburbs?
Well, the thesis of the book is a little bit more nuanced than the title. What happened was I started observing there was the very sort of whiffs of census data had come out that sort of had the framework of a very big story that I thought wasn't being told. And the gist of the thesis is basically that we are, as an American people, really tired of the suburban lifestyle for a number of reasons. And the suburban lifestyle is actually how most people in this country live. That's starting to change, but in terms of percentage, number of homes, number of people, we are a suburban country. So I thought, if that's true, that our sort of love affair with the American suburbs is peaking, that is a very, very big deal, and that's worth exploring. So then I set out on exploring it. The reasons we're tiring from it are numerous, and they're complicated, and it's not because of the financial crisis, it's because of, or the housing crisis, it's because of a number of other longer-term forces. But the thesis is that people are tiring from this kind of, what has been held up as this pillar of the iconic American dream. The thesis is not that everyone's going to live in a skyscraper in New York City. That's impractical. That's not the way most people in this country want to live. So the thesis is more one of kind of urbanism everywhere. People want to live in a place where they can walk to get a cup of coffee. That's basically the thesis.
So we understand that you're addressing a bunch of structural issues. To really understand the shift, let's go back to the idea of what a suburb was supposed to be in the first place. As a child of the 70s and 80s, I thought until I was an adult that suburbs were the de facto way that people lived. But they're actually fairly recent, right?
Yeah, they really, our modern suburbs are a product of the series of policies and a sort of particular perfect storm of where we were as a country right after World War II. So I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the history of how the suburbs came to be, and it's really fascinating, and it's it just is very much mirrors where we were as a country. So there were suburbs. I actually go back to Mesopotamia in the beginning of the book, but don't let that sway you. We had suburbs. Our first real suburbs were these sort of pre-war in the 1800s villages that sprouted up kind of organically around train stations. Our housing pattern is always arranged around our transportation because you have to be able to get around. And so when the only way to get around was by rail or by streetcar and then on your own 2 feet, towns were designed a lot differently. They were, here was the rail station, and the towns kind of came up organically around traditional urban planning design, which was a grid pattern, it had been that from the days going back into antiquity. And the densest area was right around the station, and that's where the villages set up shop, the shops set up, because that was the easiest place for people to get off the train and do their errands and then walk home. And so as a result, these towns had a very organic feel, and it's a very pleasant feel. These are towns that we see now, and a lot of the suburbs around New York City that are older have that kind of design. They're all over the country, but it really has more to do with age than anything else, because they were built around people and people's needs and people's day-to-day needs. And then...
Well, so right there you said they do their errands and then they walk home. It seems like a lot changed when walking was replaced by driving.
Yeah, that's what kind of it blew up the entire model and led to something else, and that happened when after a number of things. The car was invented in the early 1900s, but it didn't really take off and didn't really catch hold with the middle class until right after. Well, I don't know, the 30s, the 40s, but the whole explosion happened after World War II, when we had all these returning GIs coming back from the war, millions of them. We had a housing shortage, which is hard to even imagine now because we have the exact opposite problem now. But after World War II, we had 16 million GIs coming home and nowhere to put them. People were living with their parents, living in dining rooms. People were living all over the place. And we had this housing problem, and at the same time, the car had just taken off. There were federal policies that had put in place the Federal Highway Act, which laid the groundwork for 41,000 miles of paved roads for us to get to and from these towns. We were sort of, there was this wonder of mass production in the home building industry and everywhere. So the housing companies had just been able to perfect the technique of, mass producing single-family homes, and the FHA had been created to fund long-term mortgages and make home ownership a reality for everybody. So all these things kind of combusted together, and they just led to this explosion in a different kind of development, which was the cutting and pasting of these much more modern subdivisions and suburban communities all across the country. And they have a very different design. The streets are wider, they're loopy, it's like cul-de-sacs that feed into other connector roads that feed into arterial roads. There's a very specific blueprint for the modern suburbs, and that's what worked. They thought this was the future, and then everyone just seized on it, and that's why a lot of the towns that are a byproduct of that era tend to look
So golden age for the suburb. Like,
yeah.
If you could go back in time to a specific year and it was the thing, what year would it be?
People are obsessed with, oh gosh, that's a really good question. I would say, I don't know, 1884. I mean, the late 1800s.
Okay, that's the old suburbs.
The old ones.
I'm talking
the old
like
ones
Don Draper time.
19, I have to look. I have a couple stats in the book that, there was a house that was built in like 3 hours. I mean, this was, really, the machine was cranking on all cylinders. And it was...
I don't think any of us would want to live in that house.
No. Although we did it again during the housing boom. Those houses were built pretty quickly, too.
Yeah.
But it was probably the mid-1950s. Levittown, the iconic suburb on Long Island, opened in 1946 or 47. And that was sort of the first of these modern subdivision style mass-produced suburbs. That was sort of the beginning of the modern suburban era. And then from then on, I mean, that's still what we have. And it worked very, very well. I mean, look at all of us here who grew up in the suburbs. This was, the American way of life. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s. I would say it started to change in the 80s when we just sort of jumped the shark a little bit in terms of the development of the suburbs. And we saw the beginning of real suburban sprawl where towns sort of ceased having a center, and it was all sort of about the strip mall and the office complex and the commercial center, and then the houses were somewhere different and very, very far away from all that stuff.
One thing you talk about in your book is social isolation. And it strikes me that hasn't actually changed. So I'm curious, what has changed around that over time? I mean, it had to be true that the experience of living in the suburbs in the 60s was fairly isolating, no?
Yes and no. It's funny. I mean, I think in the 60s, the towns were, the scale was still a little smaller. There were still centers to a lot of these towns. And it was this sort of happy wonder years era where everyone had lots and lots of children, and so there were more people in the communities, and they did have a bit of a livelier feel. But even back then, I spent a lot of time, this was really fun, just looking, when you're a writer, you just look for anything, any rabbit hole to go down, and you're kind of procrastinating. And so I spent a lot of time looking at old YouTube videos of the Wonder Years, or all the pop culture references to the suburbs in our culture, because they're everywhere. And one of the interesting things I found was that it's kind of common now to take potshots at suburbia. If you look at Weeds or American Beauty or Desperate Housewives or Suburgatory, exactly, all these kind of things that poke fun at the, whether it's the cookie cutter nature or the dark underbelly that it looks so picture perfect but people have issues. That was also happening in the 50s. I mean, there was this book called The Crack in the Picture Window. It was actually the basis for the movie Revolutionary Road much later, but it was sort of a very dark look at suburbia. And then you had even Blue Velvet, very, very dark look at it. And then even this famous song, the most famous song about the suburbs, probably the song Little Boxes, which was used as the theme song for Weeds in an amazing way, and with all these amazing covers.
Everybody familiar with it?
I wish we had audio here.
Anybody want to sing it for us? No,
it's great. It's a great song. And the original song is great. But it was in 62? Very early on that this song came out that was just completely just pointing out how terrible the suburbs were and how everyone looks all the same, and everyone went to the same colleges, and this is all, it just was really, really dark. And so very early on, people were pointing out that this might not be the best way for our housing landscape to be arranged. So,
and of course, since then, suburbs have become exurbs, and they've sprawled further out, and gas prices have gone up. So talk to us a little bit about the relationship between the suburb and the car.
Sure. I have a whole chapter in the book about the suburb and the car, because that's where the whole experiment kind of went wrong. I mean, I don't want to be such a suburb hater, but that's really what a lot of people's problems with the suburbs and why people are leaving relates to problems they have with the suburbs, and almost all of those problems relate to the suburbs being designed around the car. So there wouldn't be one without the other. This was this magical idea that we were all going to, drive to these communities and use the car to get around and everything. So, but what that means is that people don't really walk in a lot of suburbs. I talked to a doctor who has spent a lot of time focusing on, he's former director of the CDC, who's now really, really focused on this issue of our built environment. That's the phrase people use to talk about, your everyday, the way our landscape is built, and its impact on public health. So he estimates that New Yorkers, I put this in the book, I don't want to come off like a snobby New Yorker, but...
She's not a snobby New Yorker.
But New Yorkers weigh, on average, 6 or 7 pounds less than the average suburban American, precisely because we have to walk everywhere. And New York, I think, is a very extreme example. Where we walk here, walking even a city block, one city block in New York City, is more than most people in this country walk in a given day. And that's not an exaggeration. I mean, it's like if you've ever had friends come out of town who live in LA or anywhere else, and this is for women, but they pack their high heels, and then you go out and you lose them after like a half a block, because they're like, what are we doing? I mean, it's just,
right.
People don't walk in the rest of the country, and that's largely because of the way our residential environment is designed. And so there's a difference between living in a community. I write a lot about the suburb I grew up in, which is an old suburb. It has a really adorable downtown. There's a trolley, there's a courthouse, there's a main street. It's kind of the ideal. It's what a lot of people want to move to, and what a lot of communities now want to be. But when you live near a community like that, you don't have to live where you can walk to it. It's one thing, you drive a mile to that community, and then you get out and you have a pleasing place to walk. But a lot of people live 10 or 15 miles from any place like that, and 10 or 15 miles from a place to even buy a gallon of milk. So that's just, you're in your car all the time. Atlanta's like this. Thanks to the housing boom of the 2000s, I mean, every state has, every urban center has a place like this, because the development pushed so out into the fringe. And so a lot of people are living where they are spending, commuting up to 70 miles one way. where they're,
And you mentioned in the book, and I thought this was funny, that everybody always underestimates their commute. Like if I asked you, I don't know, what's your commute to work? Yeah, yours. 10 minutes. Okay, you probably have an exact count on that, the close nature. Some suburban in the audience, raise your hand. Let's get one. Okay, how do you get to work?
I take the train and I walk.
How long do you think it takes you?
An hour and 20 minutes.
An hour and 20 minutes every day, both ways, each way. And so what you also discovered in your book is that when you're estimating that time, and I'm assuming that at Google, given your prowess in technology, it's an exact estimate, but the rest of the world is sometimes a little bit off and always underestimates that. It always takes more time.
Yeah, they do. I mean, the average, according to the census, the average commute right now, I think, is 26 minutes one way. That's a big average, so you're factoring in lots of things. But it's really hard to get the exact data because people do underreport it. And that's because they don't want to think that they've made this decision to live so far away, But wait, I had the perfect life. I have the house with my yard and everything. So there's a lot of data on commuting, and it's really fascinating. I mean, it's the things it does to people. It's not good for one thing, just time. And I think a lot of people move to the suburbs. The biggest reason, by far, is to prioritize schools and family life for children. And
so you wrote about a family like that, a family who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was having more children and decided this is it, and they moved to a town close to my heart, Westboro, Massachusetts, only because I grew up in the town next to it. And they didn't last very long. So tell us the story of that family.
Sure. This is a woman. I have a chapter in the book that's about the suburbs in the car, and the quote came from this woman, the quote for the title of the chapter. It's called, "My car knows the way to gymnastics." And what she meant by that was, they'd moved, I forget where they moved from, but they had, actually, her husband works at Google, I think. But anyway, no, we don't need to go into that. But they had moved with their 3 children. They had their 4th child shortly after they moved into this colonial house in Westboro. And the woman really wanted to try the American dream. She said, "I've never done this. I really want to do it. I want the car, I want the minivan, I want the house, I want the whole deal." And she was dissatisfied for a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons was because she really underestimated the amount of time she was going to spend in her car every day, which ended up being close to 40 or 50 miles a day because she had 4 children, and just to shuttle them around to all the activities they need to be in. I mean, if there's parents in the room, I'm sure you understand this. This is, it's soccer, practice, piano lessons, Hebrew lessons, everything. And so she was in her car from 3 to 6 every day, traveling these vast distances to take her kids to all their engagements. And she just really thought that she was going to move to a suburb and there was going to be serendipitous play happening in the streets, that people would just, kids would play in the street or in the backyard with the swing set. That was the whole point, and they would play until it was time for dinner, and then they'd come in, and that just didn't happen. She said to me, there's a play set in every backyard, but you don't have access to that play set unless you have a play date. So, I think part of that is the whole play date centric culture is also alive and well in cities. I think that's also a result of how having 2 parents working now, we didn't have that back in the 70s or 60s, 70s, 80s. I think it's part of I think the culture around parenting has changed a little bit. There's far more activities for everyone to do. I don't know that that's just a suburban thing, but that is one reason why children growing up in the suburbs today have a very different childhood than I had when I was growing up in the suburbs in the 70s, when we did play outside until 6 o'clock and it was time for dinner, and when there were tons of children running around. And so she was really disaffected with that aspect, and then with the aspect that nobody walked or they actually lived close to their school, and she tried to organize an effort to get the parents to walk a group of kids to school every day, and nobody would do it. They didn't want to do it. So, and then...
So tell me what happened. I mean, so here's a family with 4 kids. I mean, they don't fit into a 2-bedroom apartment. What did they decide to do? They ended up moving to Cambridge. They pulled their kids out of school and they found a row house. It wasn't cheap. They had to spend more money than, they incurred a serious financial burden to be able to do this. And she was well aware that not everyone is able to just change their mind like that, because the suburbs are more economical given the schools and everything. But they are living a much happier life, all of them, all 6 of them. Their kids love it. They walk to museums. They
go to a yard or a park across the street when they want to play. They have a postage stamp backyard. They have a row house, less space, but they have the kind of life that they're really enjoying. So that might not be for everybody, but I found a whole lot of people who did something like that, who actually moved to the suburbs and then moved back to cities. I mean, it's one thing to have, here in New York, we have a lot of families who actually opt to stay in the city and never go out to the suburbs. But I found a lot of people who are moving back, and many times even sending their kids to public school in cities.
So how are cities changing to become more friendly places to live?
Well, it's funny. I mean, there's a kind of reversal going on. The cities are actually becoming a little more suburban. I mean, they're just much nicer places to live than they were in the 70s and 80s when everyone rushed out and went to the suburbs. So, the narrative around cities, I'm sure everyone here has read stories or books about this in the past couple of years, but cities are all over the country, except for Detroit. Detroit is a real outlier, and some of the other Rust Belt cities. But cities are really wildly resurgent for a number of reasons. Crime has gone down. Public and private investment has gone way up. They're just vastly different places. Industry has moved out. I mean, one of the reasons why everyone left the cities was because we had a lot of noxious factories that goes way back to when we were more of a manufacturing-based economy. But and you have, cities now are
now those noxious factories are beautiful lofts.
Yes, they are. They are. Exactly. And expensive lofts. And, look at the meatpacking district you wouldn't have gone there even in the 80s or 90s. And now it's like a casting call for The Bachelorette. I mean, it's like, everyone goes there. Everyone goes out. It's sort of, cities are like amusement parks now. And so that's been a huge shift. It's driven the prices up, especially in New York. But
well, so let's talk a little bit about the economics of cities. I mean, is what you're talking about a phenomenon that really only affects the upper class and the very upper middle class? Can the middle class afford to live in cities?
That's a good question. It depends on the city. Not New York City or not Manhattan for sure. And the suburbs were originally a big solution for our middle class. And that's why they were built. And our middle class is shrinking. And so that's, I think, one reason we're seeing actually really high levels of poverty in the suburbs now. Right. So it is a bit of an economic, it's more expensive to live in a city than a suburb, especially if you have to pay for private schools. But one of the big movements that's happening, and one of the things I spend a lot of time on in the book, is this movement to sort of urbanize the suburbs. People really want to go back to this model where there is some sort of cute, lively town center and a pleasing place to go and bump into people. And a lot of people want that, whether it's in the suburbs or the city, that's all they want. And so a lot of home builders and developers and planners are kind of falling all over themselves right now to sort of build these sort of utopian urban burbs. And they don't really exist now. I mean, they exist in a few different places, but there's not nearly enough of them to suit the demand that's coming. So, the ideal does not have to be moving into a city. People just want... Is this like
the river towns, like Hipsterbia's Tarrytown and Hastings-on-Hudson?
Yeah, that's close to it. I mean, the New York Times did this story with the headline Hipsterbia back several months ago, and it was all about how hipsters the Brooklyn class was now moving up to the river towns, which offer this kind of really funky town where there's a main street and a yoga studio and a coffee shop and all that stuff. And they do, because those towns were built on the sort of old urban bones, not just the river towns, but other New York suburbs as well. But it's funny. I mean, I talked to a friend of mine who lives in Hastings, and I said, "Oh, did you see you live in Hipsterbia?" And he sort of rolled his eyes. He said, it's he said, "This isn't hipsters." He said, "This is like upstate with corporate lawyers, because it's really expensive there." And he said, "You're still in your car a lot. I mean, no matter what, you're still in your car a lot when you live in the suburbs." So, but that is, I think people are really starting to draw this distinction between the weed-style, cul-de-sac heavy, big, cut and pasted suburb, and the one with more character, and usually those are a little bit older, and we're starting to see a reversal in valuations where those, in some places, neighborhoods that are older are retaining their housing values, more so than newer neighborhoods, which in the past that was always reversed. People always want new, and you're starting to see that reverse a little bit. It's one of a number of reversals in economic valuations that play into this whole thesis.
And so you talked in the book about a man who launched an interesting experiment that essentially got squashed when the housing bust happened. But it was an experiment to give mortgages based on a broader picture than basic pen on paper financial ability to pay. Can you talk a little bit about what that experiment was?
Sure. This is this outfit out of Chicago called the Center for Neighborhood Technologies. And there's a guy there named Scott Bernstein who is just a real kind of genius in this field. And he had spent a lot of time, his whole expertise and this organization's expertise is quantifying how much transportation costs eat up disposable income. And so, people think about the cost it takes to fill up your gas tank, but it's not just that. I mean, anybody who owns a car knows this. It's the cost of maintenance, it's the cost of, everything that goes into owning a car, parking, and all that stuff. And so he did a lot of calculations across the country and found that in many markets, usually the markets that are the farthest from the sort of urban center, the sort of drive to qualify zone, as it was called during the housing boom, because the people who could least afford it were going the furthest to find the house they wanted. And actually, this woman in Boston said that too. They went so far away because, if you're going to spend, you want it to be like the best house you can buy. And that's part of this like house American dream psyche mania that we have going. But anyway, he found that in many communities, people were spending as much or more of their disposable income or their monthly income on their transportation costs as their housing costs. And that's largely because of when you're doing a 70-mile commute or two per household, that's a lot of money. And people don't think about that when they think about their housing costs. They really don't. You just think of the house itself. But that's eating up just, tons and tons and tons of it's taking a huge hit on people's wallets. So anyway, he basically devised this idea for a location-efficient mortgage, he called it, where the cost of transportation was built and baked into your monthly nut and to the kind of mortgage you were going to be able to get. And you would be able to qualify for a bigger mortgage if you lived in a more responsible place. So just actually baking in where the house was located into the actual total cost of your house that the bank was willing to lend for. And kind of, acknowledging that was a huge part of the expense of the house is going to be where it's built. And so they did really well. They did studies on these mortgages, and in a study of 300 of them or something, there was one that failed, and it didn't even ever default. They fixed it before it came to default. So these have been proven to work, and they're an idea that a lot of people think makes a whole lot of sense, but the housing bust and our economic crisis came around, and they haven't really gotten traction. It's very hard to get the banks to, move on something that doesn't,
that is indeed true.
Indeed
true.
Yeah.
So you also address this startup doing something called a walkability score.
Yeah. So this is a startup that people here might have heard of called WalkScore. And what WalkScore does is it uses all sorts of algorithms to be able to give you a score from 1 to 100 on how walkable your neighborhood is. And so you can just plug in any address and it will give you a score. So I live on West 10th Street in Manhattan, and my walk score is 100, which means that I can basically walk anywhere I need to go. Where I grew up in Media, Pennsylvania, I forget what the score is. I think it's in the 20s, but that's considered car dependent. So you can do this anywhere. So it's really fun to play around with. And this company is really riding a wave of buzz in terms of what people are demanding from their houses and their neighborhoods. So walkability is kind of this big new buzzword in real estate circles, and real estate agents are starting to use it. It's being promoted everywhere, new communities. The walkability of a neighborhood is really, seen as a huge thing that people are looking for. So 15,000 real estate agencies are now baking in the API to their websites because, when you're shopping for a house, in addition to what it looks like, how many bedrooms, is it a colonial, whatever, people are interested in what it's near. And I think that really reflects a huge change in what people are looking for from the places they live.
Yeah.
So it's a huge thing, and those communities are going to be able to command higher prices and do better. We don't have enough of them, so.
So afterwards, she'll give us all some tutoring on where to invest based on this, right?
Somebody said I could open a consultancy and advise people where to live. So.
On that note, let's open up to the audience. Do we have any questions in our audience? All right, we got somebody at the mic.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I know a little bit about, not that I know about real estate, but I know a little bit about real estate in the Central Valley of California in Bakersfield, and they have, for instance, this gigantic construction on the Grapevine called Fort Tejon Ranch, which is utterly enormous in the middle of the highest point, just a horrible place to have a complex. But also in Bakersfield itself, there's a ton of new home construction. and it looks like a nice suburban area. What I find interesting about these new homes is that they're not actually selling the home. It's a giant townhome complex, so you don't own the home in the same way that I own my home. I have the right to do whatever I want to the exterior of my house. And it seems like this is a way to bring the cost of a house down for people in that area who want to live in houses. There are hardly any apartments in Bakersfield. But I wonder if this is a trend that you've seen to make housing more affordable, but really you don't own the house in the same way that you own, again, the same way that I do. So I wonder what this trend means.
So it sounds sort of like a New York City co-op.
It does, yeah. So it's townhouses. Sorry.
They're full-size homes.
Okay.
They're full-size multifamily homes. Bakersfield has very little apartment, very few apartment buildings because there's so much space to sprawl out. Not unlike Los Angeles. Well, Los Angeles is much more contained. But it's just houses after houses, and they're building and building and building, and that paused for a while, a few years ago, but they're back in full force.
Well, if this is some sort of innovative way, I don't quite know the structure here, but people don't necessarily. The home ownership rate is falling, and renting and other types of financial arrangements are definitely gaining ground. I don't know if this is a sort of communal setup, or if it's. I don't know exactly what the structure is, but I thought you were going to say they were sort of townhomes, which is interesting because. More urban kind of style development is coming everywhere, even in places like Bakersfield, which is ground zero for drive to qualify. Absolutely. The people there do the longest commutes in the country. And I actually have an anecdote in my book about a woman who had to leave her house at 4. She got up at 3:50, left at 4. Only then would the commute be only an hour and 15 minutes. But then she'd get there at 5:15. And so she and her husband, they were rare. They actually commuted together. And they would go and park in the McDonald's parking lot and recline their seats and set their cell phones and just sleep for an hour. And on the days when she was alone, she would drive right to her classroom. She was a teacher, and she would take a nap under her desk. And then once it was time to get ready, she would get ready in the ladies' room and bring her flat iron and everything. But she would literally sleep under her desk for an hour or two. She said she felt like George Costanza from the Seinfeld episode. This is a New York audience. You guys get that, right? I mean,
all right, let's
anyway.
jump to this question over here. Thank you.
I was just wondering if, in the course of your research, you reached any conclusions about sort of the size of new house construction and the impact it has on some of the things you're describing. Because I live in the suburbs. One thing I've noticed is that a house that's like the normal size house, like my house, like 2,000 square feet. They just don't build houses like that anymore. New construction is like 3,500 square feet, 3,800 square feet, 4,200 square feet. And I was just wondering if you had seen any impact of that.
That's a really good question. That is changing. The housing boom and bust really kind of changed the psyche on the whole excess consumption and everything. Statistically, the average size of a new home it's come down a little bit. Then it went up a little bit in 2011 because for a really long period of time, or during the peak of the financial crisis, the only people that were buying houses were very wealthy who were paying in cash. So it skewed the numbers a little bit. But overall in the zeitgeist, and the home builders are changing the way they are building houses. They don't ever use the word small. It's not a word they like to talk about. So they will say our homes are now right-sized, or the floor plans are a little different, and they're making more efficient use of space. That's what everyone's talking about. But anecdotally,
efficiency is such a good word.
Yeah, it is. But that's people don't want houses where they're not using the space that they bought and paid for. It costs a lot to heat and cool. And people are really starting to recognize that. So you're seeing all these kind of interesting movements come to be also, like Life Edited, which has gotten a lot of coverage here in New York. Graham Hill, who founded Tree Hugger, has this new movement about just reducing the amount of stuff that you have. And his TED Talk got like 2 million views. There is a movement in the home building industry for the not so big house movement. There's an architect, Sarah Suzanka, she's a home designer, and she advocates for building differently so that you're using more of the space every day. And so definitely seeing a lot more interest in that. And the types of communities people want, they tend to be communities that have smaller houses.
So let's pop over here for a question.
Hi. I'm curious as to how there's sort of an elephant in the room in the story you've been telling, because the things that you've been talking about, people moving to the suburbs to go to good schools, the people being in cities having to buy private schools. And the whole white flight of the 60s and 70s and the urban decline thing is in a lot of ways a story about race. And I wonder how that ties in with the story of suburbia, because it was an explicit policy in this country that the newly built suburbs were going to be for white people. And like that was a really big factor in why everybody moved out there. I'm wondering how that figures into everything.
Great question. It's true. Back when the FHA, I won't get too bogged down in history, but there was a process when homes were approved for different kinds of mortgages, and homes that were redlined. It was explicit or inexplicit. It was people were denied, blacks were denied benefits that were flowing to whites when it came to the kinds of houses they could buy and the neighborhoods they could live in. Totally a huge part of our housing history. As the suburbs grew and grew and grew, they got so big that they became this jumble and began to reflect everything about America. So you now have suburbs in every shape, flavor, size, style, economic class, race, ethnicity, and everything. So they are much more reflective now of America in some than they were when they were born and created, absolutely. But the home ownership rate in this country is 64% on average. For whites, it's 74%, and for blacks, it's 44%. So the policies behind homeownership are still, there's vast differences, and so that's, I think, still a huge issue in our housing market in general. I don't think it plays so much a role into the migration that's happening now. I think it's a bit more everyone. The trends I write about really impact everybody.
Let's jump here.
Hi, you talked a lot about people finding the urban lifestyle more attractive and moving from suburbs to cities. I'm curious, in your research, was there any data that suggested the opposite move from the suburbs to a more rural environment or to standalone towns that wouldn't be considered a suburb, with just how easy it is to be connected?
That's a really, a really good question. Most of the research seems to suggest that people are looking for more urban and more connection. You can totally get that in the right kind of small town, though. I mean, the town I grew up in that I write a lot about is very much like a kind of Grover's Corners-esque type of place. And what people want is connection and community, and that was totally lost in the way we kind of ended up maxing out our suburbs. But it does exist in small towns completely. Some people suggested to me that the future is in dual home ownership, where you have, you see a lot of that in New York, where you have your urban dwelling and then you have your place in the country. And, I think it's a rarefied slice of the population that can live that way. But this person was sort of saying, no, you can do it. People at income levels that you'd be surprised at, this is going to be kind of the way of the future. So I don't know. I mean, I think with rural, I think the appeal of the small town is definitely plays a role. One economist I talked to talked about, he had a word for it, cities with 300,000 or less. He thinks that's going to be the future. So that's hardly small town, that's hardly rural, but smaller cities. So that's one other aspect.
Let's jump right over here.
So I grew up in Wisconsin, and pretty much all of Wisconsin is either a suburb or the rural area. And one of the ways I'd always thought about suburbs, I grew up in very much a cookie-cutter suburb, is sort of on the border between the urban and the rural, sort of places that exist that sort of geographic in nature, right? Just places adjacent to both types of communities. And, I hadn't really thought about it from the lifestyle perspective or, the choices, et cetera. I'm sure my parents had thought about it very deeply. I guess if you extrapolate outwards the trends that you're seeing, what happens to that place in between the cities and the rural areas? What do you call those, and what function do they serve? And I guess I'd just be interested to hear you sort of look forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're describing, I mean, the suburbs were, that's how they were designed. It was like, here's cities, here's the country, we're going to throw them together and come up with the perfect, mixture, like the perfect solution. It's going to be, bake them together and we'll have the best of both worlds. But I think you're talking about more of the remote suburbs that are closer to the rural farmland and stuff, where farmers made a lot of money by selling their land to developers. And actually now a lot of those farmers are making a lot of money on the other end by buying them back for nothing. But they are, yeah.
The irony.
Yeah, it is. It's great. But there's a big question: what happens to all these houses? Okay, if people are going to migrate inward, what happens to them? There's the theory of economics that if a price falls low enough, it'll be of value to someone. So maybe landlords will come in and try to rent out those houses. Maybe communities, they'll become, immigrant communities of a certain, type, or maybe big extended families will take over these big houses. Maybe they'll turn into artist lofts or something. So there's all sorts of uses that have been proposed for these houses that we have that are built far away, and that arguably there won't be a market for in the future, because we're also not having as many children, which is another factor. But that's anybody's guess. I mean, a lot of enterprising investors are buying up hundreds of single-family homes with the intent of renting them out. And it remains to be seen if that's going to be a sustainable solution. But very good question.
Let's jump over here.
I wanted to ask you specifically about Silicon Valley, and I wanted to know if that fits into your general thesis or if it's sort of an exception because of all of the wealth creation and jobs that are there.
That's a really good question. It fits in. I would say Palo Alto is a good example of the old burb. It's got this, quaint town. It's got a real center. It's a place that a lot of people want to be. The neighborhood is built at scale. The streets are narrow. There's sidewalks. The houses are built a little close together. So it has all the bones that make up a good suburb. There was sprawl outside of San Francisco. I mean, you saw it especially in the East Bay, but all over the place. So a lot of those things happen. But San Francisco came up in my research a little bit. A large part, I talk about what companies are doing. And a lot of companies are moving back to opening in big cities, or shuttering their big suburban office parks and opening in cities. So in San Francisco, you see some of the hottest startups in the past couple of years have opened in the city instead of in the valley. Google is obviously the exception to that. But look at where we are right now. 20 years ago, Google would have probably decided to locate in Mount Kisco. I mean, that's a really good example of how things have changed. This building that we're in right now, and the price that was paid for it and how in demand it is, it tells you a lot. So, but Silicon Valley is interesting. It does fit the trend in certain ways.
Let's jump right over here.
You spoke a little bit about race as it pertains to home ownership, but I wonder a bit if you know a bit about statistics about religious preference, or maybe immigrant communities that might find a more isolated neighborhood to be preferable.
One of the things I found, people like to live around people like them. So families like to live around other families. People of different religious persuasions or beliefs or whatever like to be around people that are like them. Young single people like to be around other young single people. So that happens in the suburbs. That happens in the cities. You look at Williamsburg and the Hasidic community. So I think that's always going to be the case. But those people might be moving to different places.
But I guess my point is that, and I'm making an assumption here, which is that religious groups and immigrant populations tend to have larger families. I don't know if those are true, but I believe they're true.
That's true. That's true statistically. And we need that. We need those people. The birth rate in this country is falling like a stone, and that's a whole other reason I have a whole chapter on demographics. Mm-hmm. We're not having children anymore. It's not that dramatic, but it almost is. I talk about, this is not related to your question, but my father grew up on a block in an inner ring suburb in Philadelphia where there were 41 children on his block, and this is in the 50s. And I hired a private investigator to count how many children there are in that block now. And it's a little bit informal. What?
Creepy.
I know. But there's 15 or fewer, and that's playing out all over this country. So we need the immigrant population to, sustain our longevity as a country.
Thank you.
Okay, right over here.
As you mentioned in that story you told earlier, you had a couple that moved out to the suburbs for the space and the schools, obviously. What are the trends with urban schools? Are they getting better?
That's the huge issue, because it's like, oh, great, everyone wants to live in a city. Well, the schools have to be good for that to happen, to draw the young families. And I talked to a developer here who owns a company based in it's Jonathan Rowe's company. He's a big developer, and he said that all his young people, all his employees live in the city. They're all making it work. They're all finding schools, whether it's magnet schools or public schools that are good or whatever, because not everybody can afford private schools. you know,
New York specifically?
That's in New
or is
York.
that-
He's in New York. But, you know, I talked to someone else in Philadelphia who's bringing their kids back and looking at a sort of magnet school situation. That's a big question mark. And I think the schools need to get better. I think they are getting better. But on the other hand, I think schools in the suburbs are going to face continuing challenges going forward. You're seeing a lot of them as suburbs depopulate and as suburbs age because of this declining birth rate. A lot of schools are having to merge or close, and they're seeing their taxpayer-funded resources decline, and that trend is going to accelerate. So I think it might even out a little bit more than people think.
Right over here.
So the suburbs grew out of World War II, and a part of that growth, too, was television and advertising. And we see television viewership on decline. I think it's near all-time lows. Can you say anything about the American consumer, and if the end of the suburbs is coming, will that also portend the end of the American economy? Where are the lawn tractors going to go to? All the stuff we get out of Home Depot.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. I mean, I think it's changing. So, right, in the 50s, I mean, every suburbia was baked into every single consumer marketing image you could imagine, whether it's TV commercial or an ad on a billboard or whatever. So now we're just seeing those images in different places, and those images might be changing. So maybe the American dream is not a lawnmower in a yard, but it's you know, a great Wi-Fi connection and a really cool place for entertaining your friends. And there's different kinds. It's true. I mean, you know, that's what the millennials want. I mean, that's a lot of you in the room here. But people are poking and prodding and studying the millennials to see how they want to live and what they want to, where they want to live and how they want to live their lives, because that is going to answer the question you just asked of what is the consuming economy going to look like. And the studies show that they don't want a car, which is a whole other story. The number of kids getting their driver's license is dropping, which is like really weird to anybody who grew up in the 70s or earlier. And they want other things. So they want devices, they want their gadgets, they want their smartphones, they want their, you know, Google everything. So
Leigh,
that's the difference.
And you and I were talking about this on the way over. Another way to sort of frame that idea and to really tie what you were talking about to your thesis is to think about what was going on in the 20th century. I mean, the 20th century was about mass, right? It was about mass production. It was broadcast media. It was producing things at scale. And the internet came along and really disrupted that at the end of the 20th century. And so the 21st century is about technology in search of personalization. So like all of our models are breaking down on every level.
Yep, I think that's a great way to put it. That's exactly right. I mean, everything was, right, broadcast instead of cable and everything. And so now people want that same kind of customization from their communities. Why should you have to just choose from A or B, cul-de-sac or skyscraper? You know, for a long time, that was kind of our choices in this country. I'm not really exaggerating that much. And so now people want lots of different options. And that's why this is like really a positive story, because people are going to be able to pick and choose and have a lot more options at their disposal when it comes to where they want to live, how they want to live, how they want to spend their time, which is a huge part of where you live. And I think that totally replicates the kind of changing narrative of what's happening in our country. That is a great way to put it, Jessi.
So we have time for one more question.
So I was curious, when you were doing your research, if you got into it all, sort of what I would characterize as sort of the dysfunctionality or schizophrenia of a lot of these suburban towns and their governments. Like in the town I live in, and it's very common, the area I live in, there are these endless fights about the school budget and about funding different things, and about should we have green space or should we, let that space be developed, because then that would lead to more ratables. Or you can be in one town and your taxes can be 30% lower than the town next to you because the town next to you has some big company like IBM in it or something like that. And I was wondering if you got into it all, sort of their whole suburban model of local government and whether it's going to work going forward.
That's a really good question. I didn't spend too much time on that. I mean, I did want to go and sit in on one of those meetings. I mean, I think that would have been something really fun to do, but I didn't get the chance to. That may change. I mean, I think we're going to have the taxpayer base is going to increasingly shift in the suburbs to older people, and it's going to become a bigger, kind of more diverse mix as the suburbs become kind of jumbled up, and as people see their incomes decline, I think those fights are going to get worse because you're not going to have one faction that only wants the schools to be good. You're going to have multiple factions. So I don't see that changing. I see it getting worse.
Do you think that people are less involved in their town or city government when they live in cities as opposed to suburbs? Do they feel less ownership over it?
Well, cities work in kind of micro communities anyway, so that's a good question. I mean, Robert Putnam wrote this great book, Bowling Alone, in the 80s or so, and a lot of people suggest that sprawl actually makes people less connected and feel less sense of community, even though that's what the suburbs were designed to kind of foster. So I think you see a lot of community activism in cities. Yeah.
So last question, Leigh. You've been all over the United States and the world and reporting this book. Do you have a suggestion for those of us who are being priced out of Brooklyn? Like, is it Des Moines or Birmingham?
Well, I always say in New York, we're really lucky because we have a lot of those older suburbs around us. So if you do want to move to the suburbs here, you have some great choices. But I'm still looking for that perfect utopia where you kind of cut and paste Brooklyn and you put it somewhere else that's cheaper and more affordable. And
Great.
So.
Well, thank you to Google for having us in, and thanks
so
Leigh.
much.
And the big question, I'm sure you're all wondering, I can't believe I almost got off the stage without telling you this, but there are many ways to get Leigh's book, in fact. You could buy it, you could download it on Google Play, or you could ask for it for Christmas from a loved one who could get it for everyone.
Great idea, Jessi.
What do you think?
That is great. And I think there are a limited number back there, but I don't know if they're still up there or not, but there are some here. So feel free to take one or buy one.
Thank you.
Thanks
All right.
again, everybody. Thanks for great questions.